see it. All right, so the talk that I'm going to give tonight, because we have time at the end of this, I'm going to spend a bit of time kind of introducing myself, and I always like to begin my talk from the beginning because I always find that it really grounds me in a lot of the reasons why I started doing what I'm doing and the reasons why I do it that are really like close to my heart. So a lot of that is based on the land. Just organizing myself. So I had, the title of this talk is Threads That Do Not Break, Finding My Path as a Northwest Coast Weaver, and then I kind of conclude this with a little bit of the work that I've been doing while at SAR, and then because we have the studio visit, I think there's a lot of time to talk about what I've done here as well. But I find a lot of the time when we're in a new place or when we're far away from the place that we're from, it's good to give an introduction to what the work is, where it comes from, and my own kind of path and history as a weaver. At the time that I put this together, that I felt compelled to share a little bit. So I have a little bit of writing that I'd like to share to start with. And it's the threads that do not break are the ones that we cannot see. They are those that we carry within us, the ones that pass silently from generation to generation. It's been these threads that, even though at times they may be dormant, are always present. Connecting to this requires a shift in our thinking, a way of seeing ourselves and the world around us in a new way, or perhaps in an older way, what I come to see it as now, because it can be new from the standpoint of where we are now, so embedded in our histories. I invite those of us that are in this room. There's something really magical that's created when we're able to share in the traditions of an oral storytelling. Because it becomes a living thing, and the consciousness of every person in here contributes to that space and that potential of what we're able to create for the future. And so it's always a privilege to be able to share my traditional name. It's in the Kwakwaka'wakw language, it's Kwahilaga. It means the smoke that comes out of the top of the big house and welcomes people to feast and potlatch. And on Haida Dogfish, I have maternal lineage there, and I received in a potlatch ceremony my great-grandmother's name, who is the matriarch of our clan up on Haida Dogfish, and it's Jaad Kuujus, and I use that name a lot artistically and on my online profile, for my website and portfolios. And to me, I think that's really important to me because there was a long period in my life where I didn't really think that kind of thing was very important. So this picture here is of me in Alert Bay in front of the Umista Cultural Center, and that's the community that I grew up in. And then I have a short video. What's that? Yeah. I have a short video. Well, I don't have a short video, but a friend of mine was a professional snowboarder, and she put her own funds into creating this film, and then it ended up touring with the Banff International Film Festival a few years back, and I think she did a really great job, and it kind of recaps some stuff, so just like that.
My name is Meghann O'Brien. It's my English given name. Recently, since connecting with other parts of my identity that I was disconnected from before, I've become integrated into my Haida and Kwakwaka'wakw lineages. I grew up in the community of Alert Bay, which is now that I know it, it's an extremely strong cultural community with a really deep history. There's a lot of the really old ways of teaching and of being with each other that have survived through colonization. I think we, inherit certain things that aren't healed when we're born, and I inherited a lot of shame. Even as a small kid, I never really wanted to be native, I guess. Basically, when I started weaving, it was very strong, and I felt the culture for the first time in a way that I'd never experienced. Like, I never had connected with it before. During that time, I was working closely with the original fiber we used on the coast, which was mountain goat wool. And while I was working with it, I was just feeling like I'd spent so much of my time in its environment. There was one time when I was spinning wool, but it was so rich of an experience that I was like, wow, this is I feel as alive as when I'm going down the mountain. When I started snowboarding and being in the mountains, I was really inspired by them, and I was kind of obsessed with them. I always wanted to be there, and I really loved snowboarding. Growing up and having snowboarding such a huge part of your identity or your ego attachment, kind of attaching your self-worth to progression or to what you can do rather than your intrinsic value. I feel like it got too tangled up, so mountains kind of at one part of my life turned into a place more of a stage, I guess, and especially in I went through this process where I stopped snowboarding completely for about a year. I really wanted to return to them with a different perspective, more rooted and based in what our culture says that mountains are. Everything has spirit, and the spirit of the mountain to be in that and to just be present. And snowboarding is such a cool tool, to be able to interact with nature in that way. Value to us, and sometimes I feel like the mountains, we even approach them in the same way, that they're resources that we extract from. They're not tangible resources, but we're still approaching them that we want to take something. In my way of thinking of it. I started to think our Earth, the entire Earth, is the basis of everything that we are.
Yeah, so it was my friend Darcy Hennessy-Turin who filmed and edited that whole thing and directed it. And I think it made a big impact in the snowboard world. It's a full feature-length movie that's available. I think it's set on iTunes. And all of the proceeds for that go directly to the David Suzuki Foundation and I think Protect Our Winters organization as well. So it's a really great project, and it was nice to see it received well. Yeah, kind of in that vein of things, along with that introduction, I guess, like my origins in weaving were very much rooted in spending time on the land on the Northwest Coast, and that was largely to do with the profession of my parents. Were commercial fisher people, seine fishermen. So every summer since I was like 14, I would be going out on the boat with them. And one of my favorite things to do for a number of years, like in my early 20s, I just loved berry picking so much. And I spent quite a few years really obsessed with it when they were ripe, and then they're ripening every time one's ripe. I always am like, that's my favorite berry, and I love it so much. And it's like really, I was really obsessive about it. It's really all I wanted to do. Like I would in the rain and like into the dark almost. I was like, I need a headlamp. And I think born out of that, sometimes people, when I say this, are like, well, how is that connected? How is weaving and like berry picking, how are they connected? And what connected it for me was I heard a story from one of my elders about the way that old people used to pick berries into baskets that were worn from the forehead and rested against the shoulders. And so it would let both of your hands be free. So when you're, around in the bushes, you have both of your hands and you don't have some like bucket or something hanging off of you. So that was the initial spark for me that really prompted wanting to learn. And I spent the first 2.5 or 3 months on the fishing boat just working with the material directly. I was working with red cedar at the time. And this is the very first, well, actually back there is the very, very first thing I ever wove was that little like thing there. It's plated. And it seems very logical and intuitive that's just like what you did, And then so I made the sides of the basket and then wove into the center, which is completely backwards. But it was functional and it served an incredible purpose. And for me, the role of being a person, it just seemed like such a positive place to take a stance from, where you can take like the bark from this tree and weave this basket and it connects it with all of these other plants. And it just seemed like this really old relationship that, in my experience, had been restored. And it was really, really the most powerful time I've ever experienced in the work was that first few months. And this is another image of Darcy's work. And we kind of, I guess I love including her work and her voice in this presentation. And I had a solo show at the Bill Reed Gallery in the fall, and we included one of her pieces. But basically, she's trying to represent like nature spirits because she also believes they exist. And I really think that like through years, probably 5 or 6 years spending time on the land with this really strong desire to connect, that I think the weaving came like that. I like to believe that things can see you that aren't. They're alive, but they're not. They don't have voices like we do, And I think that they saw what was in my heart, and that the weaving came as this like incredible gift to help me connect to myself and also to the world around me. And this is a photo on Haida Dogfish. That was the basket I wove for berry picking. And it's kind of jumping forward, but this is the Skeena River. It's, along the Skeena River is said to be the origins of Chilkat weaving. And so this talk was kind of structured around mirroring like deep local to pan global, and that's kind of how my progression has gone through the work. Talked a bit already about learning from people and plants. This is inside of the big house in Alert Bay, the ceremonial house. And a few images of the basketry. So I spent a lot of time working with Carrie Dick. That first year after I got back from fishing that year, I started working with her, and she taught me to work to split my bark with like a needle. So basically the bark is soaked, and then it can be split vertically through the vertical grain of the tree, and there's also the layers of it this way. And I guess the growth ring in the spring, you can take the bark off of the tree at that time, but every other point, it's either, it basically turns into wood at the end of that season, becomes a growth ring. A lot of the times I relate the basketry. There's been a lot of different experiences working with weaving that have related to time, and with the basketry, that's why I really felt like the weaving came as this gift, because it, there's the origin point of the work where you start, and then you're weaving, you start at the center, and it's very quick to reach back to that origin point, but the amount of time it takes you to reach that same place increases. And there was this really one distinct moment where it felt like my whole energy and like consciousness or whatever, my mental space just like sank out of like my head and into this place that felt like relating to what it might be like to be a plant growing or like a tree growing. And it was really incredible sensations. And I always felt like the basketry, I feel like, is where I feel most grounded and like it's a medicine for me. That piece is called Growth Rings of Cedar. That was the one where that happened. And it just felt like you were traveling along this really slow arc of time. And I have a few pieces where, I'll work on them periodically. And this one I worked on for over the course of 2 years. And I went through 2 full sets of snowboard sponsors and quit snowboarding. So I was writing for a company called Forum and Foursquare, and then I switched to the North Face and Yes. And that was like, I'd been writing for Forum and Foursquare for a while, but then that stopped. And then I started writing for these other companies and then stopped snowboarding. So it was kind of funny. And that one is one of the only ones I've done it for, but I counted the number of pieces going around and then up all the rows. And it was like 33,000 stitches from the turn, which was just like, I don't know how else you could calculate stuff like that. Like other pieces might have more, but a lot of time spent with that. And then this is a piece that was kind of prompted by a couple that I've known for a while. And I had woven it really plain, and I was really, around the time I started this piece, I was really, really discovering my love for Agnes Martin's work. And so I was just thinking about like the baskets as like circle grids and just wanted to make it super, super plain. And I love, part of the obsession, I guess, is like loving the way that the stitches stack onto each other and then being able to look at one row all the way down. And there's just these really neat captured moments in time. Like it's so material, like the creating a form in space, I think, is like a really magical thing. And when I started thinking of that, it doesn't exist. And then all of a sudden it's a form in space and it can contain so much. A lot of these are like really miniature as well. And I've kind of been drawn to that. But yeah, just to finish this piece, my cousin Jay Simeon is probably my favorite Northwest Coast artist, and I've wanted to work with him for a while. But this couple, they asked me, if I had plans for the basket, and I didn't have any specific plans. And they were like, well, would you be open, if we bought it, getting Jay to paint it? Because Jay works in miniatures as well, and he is just a phenomenal jeweler. So he designed a skull pin, which is one of our family crests, and painted it. And I was really excited to see that happen. I don't know if there's anything to conclude about the basketry and weaving, but there was one thing I wanted to mention that's kind of a little bit heartbreaking, because lately on my social media I've been seeing news from back in BC. Last month, there's just so much drought happening with like environmental change that's occurring right now, I guess. That entire like forest full of salal is like a berry, like a short little shrub berry. They're going like browning and dying off en masse all over Vancouver Island and around the Lower Mainland, and that's really scary. And then I've been seeing articles, and it's been predicted for a while, but just the kind of like weather patterns we're having now, that a lot of the cedar trees are actually dying off as well. And they've said that for the last few years it's been 5 to 10% each year, and they're dying from the top down because there's not enough water, because it used to rain so much, I guess. So that's like super heartbreaking, because a lot of the times when I was, working or encountering more contemporary Indigenous art, and a lot of people are like, I'm multidisciplinary, and like I work with materials that are in the here and now. I'm not stuck in the past, just very insistent that like, wanting to assert our individuality and like our own experience through our art, which is like relevant. But my thing was always, cedar trees are still here. I am working with something that's here and now as well. And why should it be irrelevant just because my ancestors like did it, So I don't know how like drastic the things are going to happen on the coast for the trees, but pretty scary to think that like something that I've loved so much and has given so much to our people could potentially not be there anymore. So yeah, the Chilkat and Raven's Tail weaving, I like to honor my teachers. I worked with Carrie Dick, who's around my age, and Sherry Dick is her mother, and she's a Haida Chilkat weaver, and then William White was her teacher as well. So Willie's had 3 major apprentices. All 3 of us moved to Prince Rupert, which is in northern British Columbia, to work with him, and each of us worked with him for about 2 years. So Sherry was his first, and then there was a woman named Pearl, who's a Chilkat weaver, and then myself. And they shared with me, a pretty deep respect for the techniques of Chilkat and Raven's Tail weaving and the ceremonial use and cultural use. So that's been something that's been really instilled in me from working with these teachers, and they very much trained me in like, I think like an old way, like Willie, he needs to speak to your mother and your grandmother and let them know that he's going to be taking you and like kind of retraining you in certain things and certain spiritual beliefs about the work. And this is the style of weaving called Raven's Tail, which I'm not working in as much lately. But this one was my first major piece. It's when I got my tattoo. And after about 2 years after I finished it, Willie, he'd always encouraged me to gift a piece into family and cultural use, and he's done that himself. Just because the labor involved in a lot of these weavings makes it so that not a lot of people can afford to purchase one or hire somebody like commission it. So I think it's really important to make sure that the weaving and the art form is being used where it originally came from. So just contributing into like the rebuilding of our contemporary societies. So that piece went to a chief on Haida Dogfish, who's our opposite clan. He's a Raven clan from the village of Yan, and the chief's name was Skeel Hilans. And that was where the potlatch where I received my great-grandmother's name. And then this is a close-up of a piece. It's nice on Haida Dogfish. A lot of the dance groups, they'll really invest in each other's art. A lot of the carvers will can afford on Haida Dogfish to commission pieces to be used, which is really great. And then I worked for a while. Because of how I started weaving with cedar bark and how much it offered, it was really important to me to have an opportunity to work with the original fiber that our people made the regalia out of. So I'll just like talk over this as it's going on, but I basically spent, the start of it's just kind of like picturesque stuff from the Nass Valley, which is like a lava field in northern BC. And also, they also have an origin story for Chilkat weaving. But from the time that I started working with the wool weaving techniques of Raven's Tail and Chilkat, I always really felt a strong desire to connect to the original material, because I felt like, we're using merino wool, and wherever, in New Zealand it's there. And I learned from a woman recently that it was an introduced species, so there's not a lot of cultural context for use that in their culture either. But I just kind of felt like there's this thing that happens, when you ignore what something is and you send it through a machine, or, you don't acknowledge that there's something there to learn, and so then there is nothing there to learn, But it was, for me, like a show of devotion to the spirit of the art form to want to just take it from the very beginning. So my ex-partner, who is Simshan, and a friend of his, they hunted this mountain goat along the Skeena River, and when it happened, they had done it with like a bow and arrow, and I guess there's like a story from my southern lineage we have like a mountain goat dance in that territory, and it's actually a lot of the times with other families it's done with a lasso, which was sometimes how they were hunted, but it was actually done with a bow and arrow, and so it felt very fitting. Yeah. I don't know, kind of on a bit of a time thing. Could keep talking over this. But I'd like to, this is basically just showing like my process of working with it. And there was a lot that came through working with it. In the beginning of it, I really wanted to weave a full-size Chilkat blanket out of all hand-spun mountain goat wool, which, undergoing the process of trying to do that gave me a tremendous appreciation for the works that are in museums that were made this way. And I worked with Emmons' book, The Chilkat Blanket, and I had a grant from the Canadian Arts Council, so I spent the full year just working with it. And I remember that moment when I first had yarn, I was like, it just gave me a lot of different teachings, I guess, and that was what it more turned into, because at the end of it, I realized I didn't really want to make a robe out of it because of how quick people are today to categorize objects, I guess, and none of us have the space and the time, and that's really what this was for me. I was given the space and time to go very deeply into one thing, and I think if you were to go very deeply into any one thing, you would uncover and unearth this like magic and like this total like transformation that's happening all around us. And so, it was kind of like, we're all on this like surface where it's just like all icy and like superficial and everything. And then you just like, you break through that and there's this incredible depth to like the world that's going on and that I think our ancestors were really in touch with. So one of the things that came out of that work was, a different technique working with weaving, because you can see on here, this is the loom that it's hung from. So it's hung at 1-inch increments, and then it's all finger twining. It's all 2- and 3-strand twining or braiding, depending on if it's Raven's tail or Chilkat. And we don't have any like shuttle or like any guidance for the edges. It's all like, I think it was on that first robe where I really realized, the work is like such a clear reflection of you and your energy and like what's going on for you. So any kind of tension or like negativity will go into the work, and it's something I find that like you can't get around that. It's just something that happens no matter how good a weaver you are, And so I came up with this like thing that I really liked, and it worked really well because I didn't have to use anything to measure on this piece really. Like it usually would be measuring every like half an inch to make sure nothing was going off on the lines, because when you're a span like this wide, a lot can go wrong. Pieces can buckle this way, and then your lines can develop like little waves in them that become very exaggerated by the time you're a foot down. And but I figured, if it's reflecting what's going on in you, I had this like technique where I would sit and I would meditate about a line going down the center of the body and then across and then a pane of glass. And that basically you create the work inside of yourself first, and then it flows out like and through you in a way that, it comes out looking very linear, if that's what you're looking for. So it's also called gravity weighted. There's no tension on the bottom, which is also kind of different. And then a couple shots of that piece later on. This is the piece that after working with the mountain goat wool, it's called Sky Blanket. And I basically worked with a couple of other artists on, like my cousin Jay designed that face. But I basically like wanted to articulate through the weaving what I had experienced with working with mountain goat wool, which was another like kind of distortion or different relationship to time. And I wanted this piece to more be something that people from any culture and any group basically could relate to. And it's meant to represent the three faces, like ancestor faces, and Chilkat weaving will usually be placed inside the body cavities of a crest figure, recognizing like the human spirit within. So this one, I wanted the faces, to me, they're representing the past, present, and future, or our ancestors, our descendants, and us alive today. And it's meant to articulate kind of our connection across generations through art. A lot of the times when we visit museums, we're not able to speak with the person that made that piece, but they're still communicating with us in this incredibly visual way. A lot of weavers talk about, and carvers talk about, how visiting museum collections, it's like visiting your ancestors, and they're the master teachers. And I think we're all still striving on the Northwest Coast to get to a place with our art forms where we understand them the way our ancestors did. So a lot of this is kind of getting into, I guess, where I've been now and kind of where, like, what directions I'm taking now with things. The traditional role, the role of traditional art forms in a contemporary world. I guess, the art market is here, and a lot of the reasons why I started weaving aren't finding the place for this work today is something I've struggled with. Mostly, I don't have any struggles with the Chilkat the Basketry or the Raven's Tail, but Chilkat, a lot of the times, Chilkat weaving was worn by a chief, and it was worn ceremonially. They weren't everyday garments. They were, I guess, just these pieces that were woven by one person and they were worn by one person, but they were seen as belonging to the entire clan and representing the entire lineage. So there's a tremendous spirit in the work, I think, that for me it feels only having a piece only having a piece as an art piece on a wall to me is this weighted down feeling of they're meant to be worn, And I was going through this for a few years, so I was playing with the idea of maybe weaving supernatural beings instead of a crest figure. And so these are all mouse woman designs that are bentwood box designs, and they're more form-line than Chilkat design. They're Chilkat techniques, but you kind of have to break both of the traditions to be able to use that. And then I did another piece called The Spirit of Shape, and I worked on that one for around 3 years, and it's basically a cut-up robe that was cut ceremonially and distributed to guests, and then refashioned into an apron. So I wanted to weave that piece as a complete piece. Also, kind of avoiding the crest figures. And there's the shot of the techniques. So all of the vertical pieces are all braids. I've got one on the loom right now that's like a super miniature piece. So I've been exploring other ways. I think it's kind of goes into in alignment with maybe jewelry, like gold and silver jewelry on the Northwest Coast that have crest figures on them. That's a really accepted thing, and by our own people and by the greater society, nobody feels uncomfortable wearing that, So I've been working on kind of expanding the forms expanding some of the forms, I guess, that these pieces can be worn as. And then I dabbled a little bit with, this is Indigenous Fashion Week in Toronto last year, which was an interesting experiment as well, I guess, in seeing how that felt. And I also was participating in Western Canada Fashion Week. And it was funny because the basket on the far side there was one of the first pieces I ever wove, and it was a lot of work, just to have 10 looks on a runway. So not like I could do that every year. My output of work isn't that high. So the leggings. My sister owns those leggings and dances them a lot. Yeah, and then some more of these necklaces, and that's, yeah. I think because of time, I'm going to kind of really skip over a few things to get to where I am now. Because there's quite a few pictures of necklaces and things, different designs and stuff. Yeah, that was after the fashion show. Very, very big difference between how people treat things in a museum gallery space versus like models on a runway. Just like, okay, please just like throw it in one pile, like, and I'll care for it later. I'll just touch more briefly, I guess, on this, just because it's in the thing, and I guess I can play this while I'm talking. And it has no sound. It's basically like that desire to have things used. I mean, that sky blanket piece was used, or basically I finished it in 2014, and it traveled up until last year, basically constantly. And my friend Jamie Isaac curated a show called Border X, and she's touring that across Canada until 2022, and asked for that sky blanket piece to be a part of it. And I basically said, you know, if I do that, that'll be close to a decade where this piece has been just shown in museums and never used in the big house. I don't know. And so I told her like a pretty firm no, and then we ended up deciding that that in order to still have it in the show, that we would explore 3D printing that piece. And we reached out to a couple of different people that we knew. Bill McLennan, I think at UBC, pointed me in the direction of Simon Fraser University that had Making Culture Lab is what they're called. And I ended up working with Kate Hennessy and her team there. And it's been a really great fit. So we've been working together now for about 8 months. And their digital designer, Conrad Sly, and myself, in our conversations about this whole 3D printing process and what that would look like to 3D print a piece this big, it ended up being time constraints and also financial constraints. So we ended up making this digital animation that's meant to show the piece in like a really high fidelity version of it that gives it a lot of like structure like the real thing would have, to be projected on the wall where the robe would have been. And then his process and the process related to the mountain goat wool was really incredible because there were so many similarities linguistically with the terminology that it was just really beautiful. And then from here it just kind of goes all the way back. I'm going to see if I can skip ahead. But yeah, there's some images of like his process. So it was the photogrammetry process was all the way around, all the little points there are where he took a photograph of the front and the back of it, and then they were digitally stitched together to create this crazy high resolution version of it. And I've been really excited about this because, it's interesting to me that technology have felt very alienated from it most of my life, but through speaking with Conrad and his perspective on it, and also realizing when I thought, okay, we'll try 3D print this piece, I kind of pictured it, okay, we'll print something in this box and it's going to make a whatever and spit out another version of it, no problem. And I think Jamie had that thought too, but this is months and months of work by multiple people. And yeah, the human element in technology is something that caught me very off guard. And again, the relationships that I've formed with these people who are very thoughtful, a really thoughtful group of people has been super exciting. So yeah, exploring all of that. And then for the reason for it is then technology, for that technology to have given us the capacity to take that piece, out of the museum circulating thing and into the big house. And my grandmother, she's 82, she's wearing it there. And my sister Avis, she's wearing a bunch of pieces too. Yeah, and then my sister Avis dancing it. It was just it was really cool. I think, 3D printing seems to be a very I don't know, just seems to be this really wild thing that's happening in the world, and who knows where it's going to go. But the one positive role I think it could have is like recreating pieces that are in museums and then repatriating pieces back to communities that want them. And I mean, I own this piece, so it's like not quite like, it's not like I don't have the choice, but it's nice to be able to have representation and have those conversations happening. Because even Jamie said, like, when I told her no, she was like, I told her no, and I was like, I want to have it, used in our community at least once, like, I can't, my grandma's getting old, like, I want her to be able to wear it, like, what if she dies? It doesn't happen. And she was like, oh, she really caught herself off guard, I think, in thinking, like, so highly of the museum space, and that's the ultimate goal, that, like, why shouldn't it be coming home and being used? I don't know what that is. Yeah, that's shot on Haida Dogfish, and then, my fellowship here. So I've been in kind of a strange space with everything, but I've been, able to, through my time here, explore a few different things that I might not have otherwise, because I feel like I don't have the weight of, like, needing to find a place for them. So sometimes I think my fashion, like, taste or aesthetic, or where I'm thinking I'd like to take some of the weaving. Like, I love doing the pendants, but I think those are very universal and can be worn by a lot of people. But I've done a little bit of things like these are designed to be hoop earrings, but they can also be worn as bracelets. But basically, because you're hanging it on the loom in a complete circle, you have to be able to fit your hands in there to weave. But I'm pretty excited about those pieces as bracelets, and then as the earrings. And then this is a progress shot of this piece, which is like, sometimes, even there was a group of textile people who were at the Bill Reed Gallery show, and my partner overheard them. We're like, how was that done? Do you think it was like needlepoint? Like, do you stitch it on after? But like, a lot of the times, like, I mean, it's just, let's go back, because it's really like, Chilkat weaving is probably one of the most, like, intellectually demanding activities. Like, it's very, like, Raven's Tail can be really meditative and relaxing, but Chilkat, I feel like, is a very demanding art form of a person. It requires a lot of you, and then it worn again. And then I played with having, like, a whole skein of, so all of the cedar, this is yellow cedar bark that's been boiled in the warp and then spun with the wool. And that's part of the Chilkat tradition. But it's in an ancestor face, and then it's worn as like a super long piece, or can be looped so that the face is close around the neck, and then it hangs around there. But it's very long. It's a little bit too long. I might try something else next time. And then I started a couple of different baskets, and I really like working on them slowly. But this has been something I was like, because just based on the way that you hold the materials, it kind of like naturally does this little curved thing when it dries. And I thought that, would be really beautiful as a bracelet. But it's incredibly delicate. Like, the pieces that aren't woven are really brittle if they're dry. So I've been thinking about incorporating or getting some training in like goldsmith techniques for a while. And then somebody actually recommended that I look into the work of an American jeweler named Mary Lee Hu, I think. And she actually applied weaving techniques to gold wire. And I thought about that at first with that. Like, maybe if I had the gold wire and then wove around it with cedar might look cool. But then I thought it might not. But then I saw this woman's work. And I mean, her work looks incredible. And it looks like, has that fabric, like almost like ribbon or something with these necklaces. It's gorgeous, but I don't know how I could make that, but I loved it as a bracelet. And sometimes with the basketry, I love wearing them as earrings too. And that's just a shot. I spent a lot of this residency splitting cedar bark for spinning, because it always shocks me how much you need to spin Chilkat warp. It takes me about a week to spin a skein of Chilkat warp. And so One of my next projects I want to do is like a full-size chief's robe, and it's one of Robert Davidson's designs, so it's like a super contemporary but really challenging, and it's like a full 62 inches. So I just, I need to spin wool for like 4 months straight just to get all of that. And then that's the piece that's on my loom right now, and it's just a piece of paper over top of it. But you'll see how crazy it looks if you come to the open studio, because it's all like mangled looking all over the loom. But yeah, that's it.